Let's talk about Barnaby Joyce defecting to One Nation. Now, I know that I'm slightly late to this news story, and the news cycle has slightly moved on, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about anyway, and talk about why it is that he moved, and whether this is good or bad for One Nation and for the coalition. And spoiler alert, it's going to be good for One Nation, probably not brilliant for the coalition, and one can see why Barnaby Joyce has done this after becoming fed up with the Nationals. And if you've got any thoughts about it, well, let me know that in the comments below. Now, Barnaby Joyce and Pauline Hanson had been discussing him defecting to One Nation for quite some time, particularly after he revealed that he was not going to stand for re-election in New England. Now, there was some debate about whether he would even necessarily win that seat, although personally I think he probably would have. Whether he would win that seat as an independent against a national, well, that is another question. Still, he was in a relatively safe seat, in my opinion. However, he had become slightly fed up with the Nationals, and that in large part is because he felt like he was being sidelined. That's my inference. It seemed like he was once the leader of the Nationals, he had gone more into the backbench, which many leaders might do, and many leaders, and it seems Barnaby Joyce was one of these, accepted that his role was no longer leader. But he seemed to believe that he now had zero influence over party direction. And he seemed to believe that it was almost like a Kafka-esque problem here. It's as if he was stuck in the Nationals, trying to scream that something was going wrong, at least in his opinion, and they wouldn't listen. Somewhat like Kafka's Metamorphosis. Or another way of putting this is that Barnaby Joyce might have seen himself as being akin to Sisyphus, pushing a rock up a hill. In this case, that rock being policy. He believed that he needed to keep advocating for policy change to ensure the Nationals had a future. But because no one was listening, he was pushing this rock, this policy, up a hill, and he simply was not able to create any progress. And he might have felt that his future in the Nationals was somewhat bleak, and he therefore shifted to One Nation where he felt he might have more of a policy impact, and where he felt that the policies might align more with what he currently believes. That's my inference about why he defected to One Nation. Now, they did discuss this a little bit, but of course, being politicians, they do need to be a little bit circumspect about exactly the discussion about the to's and fro's of moving between parties. The next issue is whether this is good or bad for One Nation. In my opinion, it's generally good for One Nation. One of the underlying problems that One Nation has is a lack of high-profile people running in particular electorates or in the Senate. Now, granted, they have some high-profile people, but not enough. They have, for example, Pauline Hanson's daughter, but she did not win in Tasmania. Arguably, that was because she left her campaign relatively late and therefore didn't really have enough time to establish herself, but still, she didn't win. Many people, myself included, would not be easily able to name a One Nation senator other than Pauline Hanson. Similarly, in their candidates for the House, and Barnaby Joyce, it appears, is going to be running for the Senate, in the candidates for the House, well, there aren't really big names there generally. For example, in my electorate, which admittedly is not really One Nation heartland, but in my electorate, which is Wentworth, the One Nation candidate didn't even have a clear profile photo or even a clear bio that I could identify. Now, that is a problem, because you at least need to know something about the candidate to be able to vote for them. It doesn't need to be salubrious, but it needs to be something, and that is a problem when they don't have, well, really any profile. Now, to some extent, it could have been that that particular candidate had issues with his campaign. It might not be One Nation's fault, but I could not personally name any other people running for the House for One Nation. Having some name recognition is going to help them, and they need more people with name recognition than just Pauline Hanson. You can't just have one person that people know, because then it looks like a party of one person. Rather, you need multiple people that are seen as credible, so if One Nation is serious about potentially forming government, or at least creating a large minority stake in the House, which they seemingly will want to do, then they need to be able to present themselves as a credible party with people that people know about and believe are themselves credible and able to push policy positions. So One Nation, in my opinion, directly benefits. The only way they might lose out, And it's possible, but probably not going to occur immediately. But one way they might lose out is, for example, if Barnaby Joyce were to get into conflict with the leadership team, which again is possible given that he's had some past conflict with the Nationals. Or alternatively, if Barnaby Joyce were to want to take leadership and Pauline Hanson were either already there or there were a different succession plan in place, that's going to create conflict. And it does appear that Pauline Hanson wants her daughter to take over the party, which might create issues for Barnaby Joyce, who, while he probably won't depose Pauline Hanson, probably won't take kindly to just being passed over for someone who has been anointed as the successor. So that is a potential iceberg coming up. In terms of whether it's good or bad for the coalition, it's tricky to know because the coalition, on the one hand, does benefit quite a bit from Barnaby Joyce in that he appears to be a good retail politician, even though they put him on the bench in the last election. It appears that he can actually get people to vote for him and, to some extent, generate a positive externality for other members of the party. So he is a useful member of the Nationals. The area where the Nationals either benefit or lose is the policy acrimony. He doesn't appear to toe the party line very well, which in the Nationals or in the coalition broadly is what backbenchers can do. It's not like in Labour, where all members of the party have to adhere to all of the policies or they get kicked out, which is how you get Penny Wong advocating against same-sex marriage at the time. Rather, they can discuss whatever they feel like. Now, the net result for the Nationals and to some extent the coalition then is that with Barnaby Joyce leaving, where they don't have that, I guess to some extent, destabilizing effect. However, to the extent that we believe Barnaby Joyce is correct on the issues, then they will no longer have that person forcibly advocating to be correct on the issues. So there's pluses and minuses. The plus being internal stability, the minus being a lack of policy expertise, or at least a reduction in policy expertise. Now this leads me to the question of, would I now be more or less likely to vote for One Nation? Or indeed, would you be more or less likely to vote for One Nation? Now ultimately that's a personal decision based on which policies are important to you. Maybe Barnaby Joyce's policies, particularly things like net zero or the One Nation policies in relation to immigration, are especially important to you. For me personally, I'm laser focused on fiscal policy, so in particular how much the government is spending and the government's tax policy. So for me, One Nation is not advocating as much on those, and they have some pluses and minuses, at least as I see it, in relation to fiscal policy. The big area that One Nation, I think, runs into with fiscal policy is I don't think they have a clear avenue to generate economic growth. That's the underlying issue they really need to resolve. Because if they're going to reduce immigration, well, that is going to reduce GDP growth. Now, people who argue against immigration might argue that either that immigration therefore is a Ponzi scheme to some extent, i.e. immigration keeps going up because you need to generate the appearance of GDP growth or economic growth, and therefore you keep having more and more people coming into Australia. And the argument so goes that the infrastructure does not exist to support a continued increase in immigration. And that argument certainly has merits. The big issue I see is that if you just cut immigration and don't fix anything else, then what you're going to result in is a reduction in GDP growth. And when GDP growth goes down or economic growth goes down, the size of the total economic pie decreases. And when the total economic pie decreases, your tax base decreases. And therefore, you're not able to raise as much money as necessary. Or rather, you're not able to grow your tax revenue to the extent necessary given the sheer amount of government spending that exists. And as a result, you're going to get governments pushing for higher tax rates, which trigger a death spiral. Because when you're pushing up the tax rates, then either the incentive to work decreases, or the incentive to invest decreases, or people who are productive and investors just go offshore. For example, as I've talked about in prior videos, Australia has a capital gains tax rate of 47% as a headline. Now, clearly there are some long-term capital gains tax discounts taking it to 23.5%. But New Zealand has capital gains tax rates of literally 0%. What this means is that if you hike capital gains tax rates and then people start to pay attention to what their CGT rate is and look for alternatives, because at the moment Australia is counting on inertia, much like people sticking to their high-priced energy plan or their mortgage provider is charging them too much, Australia is doing the exact same thing. But as soon as that inertia is gotten rid of, people can see that Auckland is 3 hours away from Sydney, and if your job, all you do, is investing, then Auckland makes more sense than Australia. And Australia needs to be careful of not hitting that tipping point where people start to leave. Now, some people might still stay for family reasons, which is certainly possible, but say someone is staying because their parents are in Australia. But say those parents pass away, that person who has built up years of resentment out of basically being treated as a cash cow will clearly defect over to New Zealand, where it is incredibly easy to move. And One Nation, in my mind, doesn't have a clear solution for economic growth and how they're going to deal with the impact of lower immigration on the tax base. Now, of course, One Nation might argue they'll go and try to cut government spending and waste. That is going to be easier said than done. Because there are years upon years upon years of bloat. And getting rid of that bloat is A, not instant, and B, not easy. Because a lot of that bloat benefits, for example, public service or bureaucrats. And to some extent, some of the waste is almost completely unavoidable. Because, say for example, you've got someone who is particularly talented at their job, whatever that job happens to be. They can either work in the private sector and earn more money, or potentially work in the public sector and take a pay cut. But if they're going to take the pay cut to go into the public sector, they're either intrinsically going to work less hours, or alternatively they're going to look for perks and boondoggles that help to offset that pay cut. Now clearly, infrastructure is a bit of a problem, but do any of us actually think the government is going to solve that, regardless of the amount of immigration? For example, there are solutions in relation to housing. Instead of requiring people, emphasis on requiring people, to build freestanding homes where there's a lot of land the person might not want or need, what you could have is you could allow people to build terrace houses side by side, potentially up to 3 stories, maybe even 4 stories, that would enable people to have torrents title of freehold properties side by side on less land, but with the same potential internal square meterage. There would be a clear solution to trying to increase housing density without relying on significant numbers of apartment blocks that have their own issue. But where are the planning controls to enable that to occur? They simply don't happen. Rather, we get an either or. Either it needs to be a freestanding house or some towering apartment block that people don't necessarily intrinsically want unless they are downsizing. That is an underlying problem. But it's not something that is really within One Nation's control. Or just think about the sheer inefficiency of the infrastructure spent in places like Victoria, where they're spending a lot of money for very, very little gain. Potentially the only gain being to the Victorian ALP that is propping up the CFMEU, which in turn props up the ALP. The net of this is that infrastructure build and housing has its own problems, but some of those problems are in fact engineered by the government itself. And it doesn't appear to be something that One Nation can easily solve, because some of those things are at the state level. And therefore you've got this trade-off. You can either have more immigration, thereby helping to keep tax rates relatively low, but having this infrastructure issue, or on the other hand, still having infrastructure issues, just with less money to pay for the inherent wastage that is seemingly occurring and is seemingly not actually avoidable, unfortunately. That said, to give One Nation some credit, they are laser focused on not increasing taxes, which is something I do very much appreciate, and I would hands down vote for them over my local member being a Allegra spender, as but one example. Still, you can let me know your thoughts about One Nation in the comments below. Do you think the decision to recruit Barnaby Joyce is beneficial or not beneficial? And do you think it will work out well or not for the Nationals? And would this make you more or less likely to vote for One Nation?